Devin Brooks was seen by them as just another black kid, someone easy to pick on, tease, and humiliate. They mocked his skin tone and treated him like an outsider, assuming he was too fragile to fight back. What they didn't realize was that they had chosen the wrong person to mess with. Devin was far from ordinary. He was the son of Marco Brooks, a name that made people whisper in fear, a name tied to a man whose enemies didn't merely lose, they vanished without a trace. Now, the bullies were about to learn a lesson that would stick with them for life. At Central Vista High, the hallways usually buzzed with chatter every morning, the sounds of laughter, slamming lockers and sneakers skidding across the tiles. But today, things were different. A new student had just joined, and Devin stepped through the front doors with a composed air. His hands were tucked casually into his jacket, and his eyes observed everything quietly. He wasn't sporting flashy attire or expensive brands. He wasn't trying to attract attention. Yet if one looked closely, it was clear he was unlike his peers. Instead of striding like everyone else, he seemed to glide slowly with a determined purpose, as if he knew exactly where he was headed and who was noticing him. Unlike the usual jittery reactions of a new arrival, he moved with an ease that set him apart. Some kids stole curious glances before averting their eyes, while others muttered among themselves about the tall, unfamiliar black student. But none really knew his true story. His father, Marco Brooks, wasn't an average man. He was a legend whose reputation was spoken about in hushed tones, a man who made even the toughest men quiet when he entered a room. Still, none of that was known at Central Vista. Not yet. Devin walked along the crowded corridors, feeling the critical stares and whispering remarks that, though on the surface seemed harmless, carried an undercurrent of prejudice. He didn't have to glance back to sense the judgment. Comments like, "He looks just like some character from a gangster movie," or "Maybe the school needs more diversity. Hope he isn't dangerous," floated around. Devin was used to this banter. It was the same in every place he'd been. Central Vista was an affluent school where most students hailed from influential families, and everything was arranged by hidden connections and silent nods of favoritism. For someone like Dylan Carter, the world was cut and dried. There were the high and the low. Dylan Carter, captain of the football team and son of a well-to-do businessman who often graced local charity events, had never faced defeat. Every aspect of his life came effortlessly, from leading the team to earning the teacher's favor and holding sway over those less fortunate. Dylan didn't need to be the top athlete, just seen as the best was sufficient. Strength wasn't measured by muscle alone, but by the belief others had in him. To him, dominance was just a game, and anyone who didn't bow down would ultimately pay. Devin, the new black student, was an ideal target in his eyes. Dylan began with his standard moves. Instead of immediate aggression, he carefully tested his target first, looking for any sign of vulnerability. He started with what he pretended were accidental shoulder bumps in the hall, so subtle that one could mistake them for chance encounters. Each nudge was just enough to make Devin stumble and spill his books. Ryan's cronies burst into low, mocking laughter, while side comments floated in the air. "Maybe he's here for a scholarship. Our school could use some diversity. I hope he isn't packing anything dangerous. These guys are rough." These antics weren't new to Devin. He had seen bullies like Dylan numerous times. They didn't aim to win, only to force others into submission. Yet Devin never reacted in the expected way. He never drooped his head or gave a nervous smile. Instead, he simply continued walking as if nothing had happened, a calm indifference that only enraged Dylan further. Dylan Carter had never tolerated being ignored and was determined not to let it happen now. He wasn't about to lose control over his prey. Devin's lack of reaction only fueled Dylan's desire to provoke him further. In his world, controlling people didn't require physical blows. It could be accomplished with a sly look, a smirk that said everything, or a perfectly timed remark whispered in passing. But Devin was different. He neither responded nor looked down. He merely maintained his quiet, almost unnervingly relaxed pace. This wasn't a sign of fear. It was pure confidence, a deep understanding of the unspoken rules of their environment, and it infuriated Dylan beyond measure. Taking advantage of the busy, jammed hallways in the morning, Dylan started pushing the boundaries. With the corridor full of students, it was simple to disguise a deliberate shove as an accident. Dylan deliberately crashed his shoulder into Devin as they crossed paths, expecting a burst of anger or at least a flinch in return. Instead, Devin kept on moving without a second glance. Dylan's grimace grew as his entourage began to murmur among themselves. He's showing disrespect. Maybe he thinks he's above us. He probably has no idea how things work around here. But Dylan didn't need their input. He was well aware of what was going on, and he wasn't prepared to let it slide. One day, while Devin was opening his locker, Dylan approached him, not with a plan to physically shove him, but to force a reaction by staring him down in the eyes, searching for even the slightest sign of hesitation. "Hey kid," Dylan said slowly, every word laden with condescension. "You must feel pretty out of place here, huh? This isn't your home turf." His cronies roared with laughter, and a few nearby students peeked over, then quickly averted. In their eyes, Devin closed his locker deliberately. He wasn't angry, just unhurried. He turned to face Dylan, his eyes meeting his for a brief moment. The expression on his face was cool and empty, not fearful, but completely detached, as though repeated confrontations had sapped their intensity. At that moment, a shiver ran down Dylan's spine. It vanished as quickly as it came, but it was real. Devin didn't speak a word further. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Dylan standing there with his forced smile slowly dissolving. Had he really made his mark? Had he managed to humiliate Devin in front of everyone, reinforcing his status as the top dog at Central Vista? But deep down, something felt off to Dylan, a nagging sensation that despite his efforts, he'd lost something vital. Clenching his fists, he resolved that if Devin ever tried to slip out of his notice, there'd be consequences. Devin Brooks could keep quiet all he wanted, but Dylan was sure that soon he'd have no choice but to force him to speak up. Dylan despised feeling ignored. He wasn't accustomed to being sidelined, and the idea of someone meeting his challenge with absolute indifference was unbearable. In the past, whenever he picked on someone, he would always get the expected reaction, a stutter of fear, an angry outburst, a humiliated bow of the head, which fed his ego. But Devin didn't react. He simply stood there, calm and unmoved, as if all Dylan's taunts were nothing but background noise. This quiet defiance was a silent challenge, a clear signal of war. In the cafeteria, as soon as Dylan entered, he spotted Devin seated alone in a remote corner, lunching in silence as usual. Devin's steady demeanor, with no trace of discomfort or signs of pressure, only deepened Dylan's anger. He couldn't let this go on. If others saw that Devin could simply ignore him without repercussions, Dylan feared that his own influence would diminish irreversibly. It wasn't solely about Devin anymore. It was about his reputation and the way everyone at the school saw him. Flashing a smirk at his friends, Dylan strode purposefully toward Devin's table and raised his voice just enough for the surrounding students to take notice. "Look, all alone again. No one wants to hang out with you, huh?" Laughter burst out from his clique as a couple of onlookers quickly turned away, unwilling to get involved. Everyone knew the unspoken rules at Central Vista: never interfere, never side with the victim, and certainly never oppose Dylan Carter. Devin didn't reply. He continued eating, eyes steady and undisturbed. Meanwhile, Dylan's eyes narrowed as he waited for any sign of a reaction, anger, confusion, or frustration, but nothing came. The silence felt like a nonverbal declaration of war. An invisible slap that embarrassed Dylan more than any overt action ever could. In a split second of lost control, Dylan grabbed Devin's tray, clutched its edges, and flipped it across the table. The sound of the tray crashing resonated through the room as food splattered across Devin. Sauces spilled onto his shirt, drinks dribbled down his arms, and bits of food scattered over the floor. The entire cafeteria fell silent. Chatter ceased. Laughter died out and every pair of eyes fixated on them. No one uttered a word. Some students exchanged puzzled glances, while others gulped or lowered their eyes as if nothing unusual had occurred. Leaning over the mess, Dylan expected to see anger, confusion, or a loss of control, a visible sign of his dominance. Instead, Devin calmly placed his fork on the table, studied his stained clothes with a composed look, and took a deliberate deep breath, as if weighing his next move. Then he looked up, showing no anger, fear, or distress, just an eerie, blank expression that spoke of unspoken resolve. A chill ran through Dylan as he felt as if he were teetering on the brink of danger, no longer the predator, but perhaps the prey in the wild. He shook off the unsettling feeling, insisting, "This is just a stubborn kid. You can't possibly shake him." Forcing a smug smile, Dylan retorted, "Don't think you're special just because you're different." His friends roared with laughter while others averted their eyes, pretending to focus on their meals. Still, everyone knew exactly what had transpired. Devin didn't say a word more, slowly rising without haste, brushing off food from his clothes and showing no reaction that Dylan had been expecting. Instead, he simply turned and walked away with unyielding calm, a silence that wasn't submission, but a stark warning. Dylan remained rooted, watching Devin's receding back, his forced smile hardening. Had he succeeded in humiliating Devin and proving his power, or had something vital been lost instead? A shiver of doubt coursed through him, unsettling his confidence. No matter how much he tried to rationalize, one thing was clear: the battle had only just begun. Overhead, a crystal chandelier sent soft golden beams onto a long wooden table set immaculately. Steak perfectly cooked, red wine glistening in its glass, and fresh vegetables arranged artfully on white linen. Everything in the Brooks household was always precise, with not a detail out of place. Yet that evening, the dining room carried a heavy silence. No one spoke, and the pause between the two Brooks men was unbroken. Devin sat with his knife and fork neatly aligned at his plates, edge, his eyes not on his meal but lost in thought. He was accustomed to meticulously organized dinners dictated by his father's rigid rules. No phone distractions, no messy eating, no idle chatter. But tonight, he wasn't eating. Not because he was following a rule, but because his mind was elsewhere. Devin wasn't the type to be easily swayed. The morning's events at school hadn't hurt him physically or shaken his composure, yet they left him pondering how he should respond. Across from him, Marco Brooks sat quietly, enjoying his dinner. With salt and pepper hair neatly combed, and dressed immaculately in a tailored suit, Marco's presence exuded authority, despite his age. He wasn't just any man, he was a heavyweight in the underworld, a name that carried silent respect and fear. Devin had grown up under that formidable shadow, not as an oppressive force, but as a constant reminder that his family was unlike the rest. When Marco finally spoke, it was neither abrupt nor surprising. It was as if he had been waiting for the perfect moment to ask, "Is something wrong?" Devin met his father's cool, unwavering gaze with his own steady brown eyes, but no comforting words were exchanged. Marco didn't offer warm reassurances like other parents would. Instead, he demanded an answer. Devin's fingers tapped softly on the plate's edge as he considered his response. Then he murmured, "Just a few punks who think they can push people around." A brief silence fell over the table. Marco resumed cutting a piece of beef, chewing slowly, as if the words had no impact, yet his gaze stayed fixed on Devin, evaluating him like a general surveying the battlefield. After setting down his knife and fork, the subtle sound echoed. In the quiet room, marking a shift in the mood. In a low, measured tone, Marco said a single word. "Good," as if that one word could encompass his expectations. Then he added, "But remember, son, sometimes an enemy needs to be reminded of his place." Devon paused. He understood that while he might be able to handle the situation, Marco wasn't suggesting a simple act of endurance. In his world, power was never about passive acceptance. It was about taking control. Taking a slow, steady breath, Devon admitted silently that he wouldn't let anyone dictate his future. If Dylan Carter ever thought he could push him around without consequence, he'd be making a serious error. Setting his utensils down, Devon leaned back in his chair, his eyes growing colder as if calculating his next move. The name Devin Brooks had already begun to spread through the corridors like a whisper carrying the warning of a coming storm. The hushed comments, once merely fragments or furtive glances of surprise, now carried a weight that everyone felt. Devon's refusal to react was no sign of weakness. It had transformed into an unmistakable warning. He took a deliberate breath, battling the nagging tension inside, desperate for confirmation that this wasn't just a minor misunderstanding. Then, a sophomore passed by, a student whose name wasn't remembered, and in that moment, it didn't matter. Dylan grabbed the boy's shoulder with an urgent, low tone. "Brooks," he muttered. The boy's eyes widened in shock, as if asked an unspeakable question, and after a moment of silence he gulped, failing to speak. That brief hesitation was all Dylan needed to feel his own pulse quicken, the beat echoing like a hammer on steel. He released the boy and took a reluctant step back. No words were exchanged. The answer was obvious. Marco Brooks. A name mentioned, quietly by his own father during private talks, had once been invoked in a tone so different from his usual commanding manner that it unsettled Dylan. He recalled overhearing his father late one night, speaking in a softer, almost hesitant tone when mentioning the name Marco Brooks, and it struck him then that everything had suddenly begun to make sense. It wasn't just that he had picked on the wrong person. He had crossed the son of a man revered in the underground world. Every laugh, every taunt, every overturned tray replayed in his mind like sharp blades carving his pride. "No way," he mumbled, though his voice no longer held the conviction it once did. The truth was sinking in. Devon hadn't reacted like everyone else, simply because he didn't need to. He didn't need to yell or fight or display anger because he knew that such reactions were wasted energy. Deep down, he understood that fear would eventually find its way to Dylan. A real, tangible fear that wasn't just about being ignored. Meanwhile, the other students continued their normal chatter in the hallways, oblivious to the change in atmosphere. Yet Dylan could feel the weight of a card in his coat pocket, the card that warned, "Play with fire and you'll get burned." It wasn't an overt threat or a crude taunt from a rival. It was a sober reminder of an immutable fact. Dylan's hands clenched, and he felt as if the ground itself had grown unstable beneath him. The student in front no longer locked eyes with him, stepping back slightly, as if even standing near Dylan now carried risk. For the first time, Dylan Carter felt diminutive, and he turned away, his steps unsteady as he sought to escape. Though, no matter how fast he moved, the dread persisted. This was only the start. The rest of the classes were a blur to Dylan. Words on the board, lectures, scratching pens, all turned into meaningless noise as a single thought dominated. He had messed with the wrong person. The cold reminder in his pocket burned against his skin, as if it might ignite at any moment. The furtive glances in the corridors were gone. Admiration and respect had turned into hushed pity. Once, people had clapped him on the back and laughed. at his exploits, but now the air around him felt stifling. The bell rang, and Dylan stepped out of the school building, weighed down by a heavy, unshakable feeling in his chest. His instincts screamed that he needed to leave immediately. Yet when he reached the front yard, an uneasy sensation crept over him. Something was off. The usual scene played out. Groups of students, cars lined along the street, and parents waiting. But today, two sharply dressed men stood near the gate, men whose clean, orderly appearance, from well-fitted shirts to neatly pressed trousers and polished shoes, was anything but casual. They weren't students or family members, they were there for him. The realization hit Dylan hard, slowing his breath. He had never seen these men before, but there was an unspoken understanding that people like them, quiet, formidable, and unsettling, didn't need to speak to command respect. They weren't security guards or police. They were just serious figures. When Dylan halted, one of the men looked directly at him and gave a slight, formal smile that carried no warmth. "Mr. Brooks wants to talk," the man said in a deep, measured tone that left no room for negotiation. Dylan's skin broke out in cold sweat. He might have run or screamed to draw attention, but deep inside, he knew it wouldn't help. This wasn't an invitation. It was an order. Dylan swallowed hard, his throat parched, as the old feelings of power and invincibility evaporated, leaving behind only an empty shell. No longer was he the one dictating orders. Instead, he was on the receiving end. The details of how he ended up following the two men were fuzzy, like a half-remembered dream. The bustling crowd, the moving cars, the departing teachers, all faded into the background. Dylan was being drawn into a world he neither recognized nor understood. They led him to the parking lot behind the school, a place usually reserved for staff and teachers, now eerily empty. Beside a sleek black car, someone waited. There was no need for introductions or formalities. Dylan instantly recognized the person. Devin Brooks leaned casually against the car, hands deep in his jacket pockets, exuding calm, as if this were just another ordinary encounter. There was no rage or desire for vengeance in his expression, but that was what made it truly terrifying. While a person seeking revenge might lose control, someone in complete command needed no additional force. Frozen in place, Dylan could feel his fingers tighten involuntarily, though their strength had seemingly evaporated. He was no longer steering. The narrative, Devin slowly met his gaze with eyes that conveyed an icy certainty, and at that moment, Dylan realized that Devin had never truly been the prey. He had been waiting for the right moment to flip the script and become the ultimate predator. Carter had faced his share of rough patches, fights after sports events, confrontations with teachers, and even personal scandals, but he had never felt so backed into a corner. Standing there, his back rigid and eyes wide with apprehension, Dylan was rendered speechless as the two silent men behind him formed a barrier, leaving him with no room to escape or resist. Devin's penetrating look was calm, devoid of anger or vengeance, just pure, unchallenged authority. "Do you think I'm weak?" Devin asked softly, his voice low and deliberate, each word reverberating in Dylan's mind. Caught off guard, Dylan couldn't muster a reply, not for lack of wanting to answer, but because any word now would be a mistake. He couldn't confirm his weakness by admitting yes, nor could he lie by saying no. After a long, silent moment, Devin took a small step forward. The space between them felt unbearably tight. Dylan didn't retreat, but his body tensed as Devin leaned in so close that he could almost feel the cold exhale against his ear. In a measured whisper, Devin stated, "I don't even need to touch you, but if I chose to, your life would change. Forever." Dylan's back drenched in sweat, realizing the gravity of those words. They weren't empty threats like those thrown around by wannabe tough guys or idle warnings from teachers. They were deadly serious. Every word carried a cold certainty that left Dylan feeling as if his fate had been sealed. Devin didn't need to beat him, shout, or make a scene. Just one phone call or one word to the right person, and Dylan Carter's life would be irreversibly altered. Not in a minor way, like being kicked off a team, but in a way that would destroy him permanently. Dylan's heart pounded uncontrollably, but he was powerless to stop it. Devin then stepped back, his expression unchanging, leaving the message. Unmistakable, Dylan had lost. It was as if every shred of pride, every illusion of control and power had been stripped away in an instant. Everything he had once believed in now felt utterly meaningless in the face of the man before him. Devin hadn't needed to physically beat or shame him. He only needed Dylan to recognize that he had committed a fatal error. True fear, he realized, didn't come from visible wounds, but from the horror of what lay beneath. Dylan Carter was no longer the invincible leader he once was. Now he resembled nothing more than a hollow shell wandering through the hallways, a beast turned prey to his own terror. Devin, on the other hand, never required violence to assert his dominance. As the days wore on, Devin's silent presence began to govern Dylan's every move. No one discussed it openly, yet everyone felt the transformation. Dylan had once commanded respect with a few mocking jokes or a dismissive nod, but now, when Devin entered a room, no one dared meet his eyes, not out of fear of brute force, but out of an unspoken understanding that true power needed no demonstration. Devin rarely spoke, and he never reveled in bringing Dylan down. He simply lived his life with unwavering confidence. And that very quiet determination instilled a deep-seated dread in everyone. Dylan, more than anyone, sensed this change, and he found himself unable to hold Devin's gaze. Each time their paths crossed in the hall, Dylan felt as if a heavy hand was squeezing his throat, a silent panic that left him feeling suffocated. Whether it was just his imagination or reality, one thing was clear. Once Devin Brooks had taken control, there was no escape. The turning point came on a Friday afternoon. Dylan left school later than usual that day, avoiding the football field and his usual after-school hangouts. He just wanted to get home quickly, but as he reached the parking lot, the sight before him nearly stole his breath. Devin was standing right next to his car, not in any aggressive stance, merely waiting calmly. Dylan froze, paralyzed by indecision. Should he run, face him, or do nothing at all? Deep down, he realized he was completely outmatched. He could only stand there and wait for the inevitable continuation of his nightmare. Devin fixed his steady gaze on him for what felt like an eternity before slowly making his way forward. Every second dragged on, and as Devin closed the gap, he came to a stop without anger or a threatening smile, only a piercing look that made Dylan feel smaller than he ever had. Then Devin spoke a single sentence, a sentence that would be seared into Dylan's memory. "Do you understand now?" No loud threats, no bluster, just one simple question that carried the total weight of everything that had happened. Dylan was left speechless without even the need to reply. Deep down, he knew the truth. That brief moment marked a stark realization for him. Dylan Carter stood there, stunned into silence. Devin hadn't needed to issue threats or raise his voice. His calm, emotionless gaze said it all. In that quiet moment, filled with a disconcerting calm, Dylan recognized that he had truly lost control. The impact of that silence left an indelible mark on him. From that day forward, Dylan was never the same. He continued going to school, but his presence was diminished, no longer commanding the hallways or bossing his friends around. Instead, he had become a ghost of his former self. Rumors began to spread among the students about his sudden change. Some speculated it was due to a personal obsession, while others thought something catastrophic had occurred. Yet no one dared ask. The only undeniable truth was this: Devin Brooks had not done anything overtly violent or threatening, yet the outcome was crystal clear. Dylan Carter had been defeated without a single punch thrown. Devin carried on with his life exactly as before, making no show of his victory. He never boasted or tried to impose his dominance further, because those who understood his silent message knew what it meant. Anyone who tried to challenge him backed off, and the hushed whispers about him only grew louder. Devin didn't need aggression to command respect. His quiet demeanor was his most powerful weapon. Real power, as he had shown, wasn't about violence or noise. It was about the inherent understanding that you shouldn't mess with him. Dylan Carter would never again dare to confront Devin, not out of fear of physical harm, but because he recognized he was up against an opponent who controlled everything. Dylan had once believed he truly understood power, but now he realized that real power stemmed from control, and Devin Brooks possessed that control completely. Once the undisputed force in the school, Dylan Carter had lost his standing after one fatal mistake, not because he was beaten in a fight, but because he had picked the wrong person to challenge. Devin didn't need fists or shouts to win. He only needed Dylan to accept that his power was gone forever, for real strength comes from absolute control. What do you think about how Devin handled the situation with his bully? Do you believe that silence and hidden authority can be stronger than violence? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss more engaging content. Thank you for reading, and see you next time.